what I did want to talk about tonight was continuing in the theme that we started off with in the last few shiurim of looking at the different core principles that may, in another terminology, be identified as the gods, but we don't have to call it that. It's a little bit beside the point, but let's say the core non-negotiable principles of Western liberal democracies like the United States, and try to look at them through the lens of the Torah and see if we can understand where the alignments are, where the overlaps are, because there certainly is a lot that things have in common between aspects of what the Torah is asking of us, as Am Yisrael, to do here in Eretz Yisrael with our own country and our own government, sovereign in our own land and all of that, and what the principles of, let's say, a flagship Western democracy like the United States are going to be founded on. But they're not exactly the same. They don't point in the same direction. From the standpoint of the Torah, the principles of, let's say, United States, just to pick a specific example, are always going to seem overly simple, and there is a critique you can make of them from the standpoint of saying what is idolatrous about this, and that's both going to be a way for us to look at what the Torah is teaching us and see its greater subtlety and carefulness about the implications of complex issues, and also, to see the failure modes and the challenges that are presented to a system that is based on overly simple principles. And last time we talked about free speech, and it's very hard to totally exhaust that subject, but the basic idea was that first of all, no one really absolutely protects free speech. They're always kind of trying to make carve-outs for things like shouting fire in a crowded room or whatever. But if you look at the Torah and how it understands free speech, one of the things that it definitely does that, let's say, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution doesn't do is it makes sure to protect the sanctity of the name of Hashem. It creates a structure of regulations that establish the idea of blasphemy and saying this is a very serious thing, you shouldn't do it. And clearly in the US, there's no constitutional ban on blasphemy. And in fact, really, starting with the discussion of free speech and the implications of that particular issue, what we now realize is that the Torah see the linkage between free speech and freedom of religion and, let's say, establishment of religion. And so, to the credit of the founding fathers of the United States and the framers of the Constitution and all of that, maybe it's not so accidental that the First Amendment not only establishes the idea of free speech, but also connects it with the need to state that there will be no establishment of religion, and creating the well, maybe we should again just reread the text of the First Amendment so that we can get it right. So the First Amendment is about a number of different things. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So we talked before about free speech, and now we're going to talk about establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion. And what I mean by saying that these are related is because when you try to let's say, create the concept of blasphemy as the Torah does, saying, look, free speech is not something that is totally free as long as it's merely in some kind of abstract theoretical realm. You're not trying to directly incite violence. You're not shouting fire in a crowded room, but there's still something unacceptable about blaspheming the name of Hashem. Of course, the moment you do that, from the perspective of the US Bill of Rights, you essentially are kind of trying to create some establishment of religion, because what does it mean to blaspheme if you haven't crossed over into the realm of talking about the name of which God that you're trying to protect, and who gets to decide who that God is, and what the sort of definition of that blasphemy is? Because clearly this is not something where you just take a poll. The Torah has a very different stance on how we may or may not speak with the name of Hashem on our lips, versus if we're talking about some false god of some other ideology or cultic system or whatever. And so what we begin to appreciate is that really the discussion we had last time about freedom of speech, which led from the Torah's perspective into talking about blasphemy, really was already getting into the issue of establishment of religion and freedom of religion. And there, I think, it must be acknowledged, and we're going to talk about this more at length, but it must be acknowledged that that may be an issue where there's a much wider gulf between what the Torah teaches us about what to do in our own land, in a country with a Judaic system, than what you get by default from a kind of US Bill of Rights First Amendment situation. A wider gulf, I mean, then when we're talking about free speech, what we ended up saying about free speech is that, and this is true, the Judaic idea is essentially that there's a lot of positive value in speech that can be critical of power, even of the king, as we saw last time, where someone can criticize David as long as he's doing it with a kavanah that connects to the standards set by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we have the sort of discursive idea of always like you're sharpening your thinking by talking about the Torah and arguing about it. And so the Talmud is all about recording different opinions. And even in a recent shiur, I think Bar-Hayim was talking about how the pasuk in Kriyat Shema, V'shinantam levanecha, it's not just that you teach your children Torah, but shinantam is like with shen, with like the tooth, that it's about sharpening, that you are mechaded, you are sharpening someone else by arguing with them about Torah, and vice versa, and that there's a need for this. So Am Yisrael does not need to be taught by any other ideology or any other people that ever existed in the history of the world about the value of a lively discourse that represents different perspectives. That's something that you could argue has been one of Yahadut's contributions to the wellspring of human wisdom, perhaps even more so than other great ancient traditions, and because there's a suppleness to the way we approach the issue. Like we can even, it's not just some more Greek idea that you need to allow argument so that you can discard bad ideas so that you can finally arrive at the truth, which there's only one of. And then once you've figured out the truth, there's this temptation to stamp out everything that's falsehood, which has always been kind of the failure mode that, let's say, Greek type thinking or Greek influenced Christian thought has been quite susceptible to, because we have this concept of elo ve'elo, right? The idea of it being necessary for there to be more than one thing said that's contradictory sometimes in order to get the whole truth. Shivim panim la Torah, like the truth of the Torah is in its many interpretations, all of that stuff. We're capable of grasping the idea that there may be an infinity of what's true. It's just that it's a lesser infinity than that which is false. So it can both be the case that you need to be skilled at critical thinking in order to discard falsehood, but it can also still be the case that you leave room for a living community of differing perspectives who all at some level are grabbing onto part of the truth. And it's not just the case that you either have one truth and extirpate everything else, or else, you devolve into complete relativism and say everything and nothing is true, which is kind of the knife's edge that the West is always teetering on one way or another, rather dysfunctionally. So, but all of that is kind of a bit of a side point to where we want to get to today. And before jumping into the statement that I made, saying the gulf is wider when we're talking about freedom of religion versus freedom of speech, if we're comparing, let's say, the Bill of Rights to the Torah. Before getting into that, I think it's worth making a prefatory remark, which is that Am Yisrael, and or let's say the Jewish people, and especially Jews who lived in America or places like it, places with similar systems of government, but especially in America, really appreciate in their bones how good it has been to live in a place that had such a clear and real commitment to what was called then the free exercise of religion and freedom of speech also, but especially the lack of an establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion. And I think what gets very confusing for people is that it can both be the case that those principles as governing principles in the place where they held, which was in America over the last several hundred years, that it can both be the case that those principles made America a place where Jews could flourish, and in a way that was a great gift to Am Yisrael in a particular time where that was needed, and where there was a lot of great successes and sort of discoveries and brachot and blossomings and whatever that came from that, and all that credit is due to what a relative to the rest of human history, what a safe and welcoming place America was, because of its real commitment to saying, not our job to, burn you at the stake if you have the wrong faith, or it's not our business to sort of decide to try to aggressively brainwash everyone into one religious creed or another. It's not our job to make everyone love Lenin and Marx. All the other different kinds of things that people did that one way or another led to Jews being tortured and punished for their, clinging to their traditions. America has been, at this point, for the better part of 2 centuries, just a genuinely safe and welcoming place in comparison to anywhere else that Jews have tried to thrive and prosper throughout human history, because of the First Amendment and really the broader set of attitudes that led to, or that the First Amendment kind of summarized or encapsulated. So that has to be acknowledged. But it can both be the case that that's true, and it can still also be the case that that's not what Am Yisrael are supposed to do in their own land when they make their own laws. And this is, I think, such a hard idea for people to wrap their head around, that although Am Yisrael, or the Jewish people, however you want to put it, very much benefited from and enjoyed the pluralism and the lack of establishment of religion and the insistence on protecting the free exercise of religion while in galut, while in diaspora, that doesn't automatically mean that it must be the case that when trying to construct a Judaic society, that we have to model it on the society that we enjoyed living in when we were in diaspora. That's a very hard thing for people to face and to accept. And it really, it stems from a larger topic, which is in general, I think, the confusion sometimes about trying to understand, what should a Jew's attitudes about or role in politics be if they are living in galut, versus what it should be like, in the land of Israel. And is the Torah kind of general set of ideas that you can kind of abstract and then go and apply somewhere else? And should you be trying to convince other societies to live more according to the Torah, as though they're sort of pretending that they're Jews living in their own land? but kind of, with some of the details altered, or is it something else? And I think what I would want to argue is that the Torah is mostly a set of laws for how Am Yisrael are supposed to live in their own land, and of course it provides for, well, what do you do if you're not, and it gives you a framework for navigating that world, but it simply doesn't propound the idea that this is a general model for how societies all should organize themselves. On the contrary, it says this is really a set of rules for one special, particular people, the Mamlechet Kohanim, the nation of priests, who are going to have a special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is unique among that of all the nations of the world. And so it's both the case that just because the Torah expects Jews to live a certain way in their own land, that doesn't necessarily mean that Hashem wants all other nations to live that way in their land. So that's the sort of reverse point. But then the one we're focusing on now also is that you can't assume that just because HaKadosh Baruch Hu might well have approved of and greatly blessed and had a sort of, in a sense, a positive attitude about a nation of Goyim in how they treated Jews a certain way while Jews were living there out in Galut, that doesn't mean that's the same thing as the Torah that he wants the Jews to live according to in their own land. And so this is, I think, a particularly interesting issue and a hard one for Jews psychologically, I think, who've come from all over the world and from all sorts of different places and times where they've been persecuted for being Jews, living among people with other ideologies, both just other nationalities and also with associated other pantheons that they worshipped or whatever other religions that they had, other ideological systems. And of course, when we're in that situation, what we want is just to turn off the persecution, to say, please, can you tolerate us? And that's turned Jews into people who love tolerance and who incline to pluralism. And that's certainly a set of values that have their merits to a point and which have plenty of support within the Torah to a point. For example, the more than I think a couple dozen times that the Torah in one way or another enjoins upon Am Yisrael to love the ger, which sometimes may mean a ger toshav, like a goy who's not of the Judaic nation but who's living in the land, and has made a much more limited set of commitments that still involve acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and just loving the stranger and being good to them, and also loving converts who come from all sorts of nations, and all of these aspects of Torah that are authentically about accepting difference and embracing it, and in ways that are very foreign to the usual notion of a traditional and ancient conception of national identity. And so, yes, Jews both historically have reasons to love pluralism and admire it, because whenever they experienced it in diaspora, it felt better than the alternative. And also we have a lot in the Torah that's seemingly pointing in that direction. And with all of that being said, it is not the case that we have a Bill of Rights in the Torah that says when you're running your Judaic society in the land of Israel, that there will be no establishment of religion in the way that there was no establishment of religion in America, or that there will be the free exercise of anything that you could call a religion in the same way that there was in America. And so that is most apparent in psukim, for example, at numerous points that talk about the Canaanim, right, the Canaanites who lived in Eretz Yisrael before Bnei Yisrael were supposed to come in and conquer it and take it over. And the Canaanim had gods that they worshipped and idols that they worshipped, that they made of those gods, and they had rituals that they used to do that, which involved, for example, in some cases, doing child sacrifice to Moloch, but also other things that were avodah zarah, that were foreign worship, that were worship of idols, and it was prohibited. And so the Torah says, when you come into the land, you're supposed to erase those idols. You have to tear them down. You can't derive benefit from all the sort of wealth that they amassed around these sacrificial cults. You have to just get rid of it. And you have to conquer the land and eliminate the cultic practices in the land that are idolatrous from the standpoint of the Torah. And I think one of the things, first of all, that is often missed about this is that there's already something much more pluralistic about this than what you sometimes see coming from other quarters in humanity, because of the particularism at the geographic and national level of Am Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is not in Brazil, and it's not in Australia, and it's not in Vladivostok and wherever else you could pick on the globe. It's a fairly small and well delineated patch of territory. There are a few different definitions of the borders of Eretz Yisrael that are given in the Torah, but one way or another, it doesn't get you to Spain, it doesn't get you to Madagascar. And so what we're talking about here is a lack of what you might call religious pluralism within a narrow territory. And then, while it's true in principle that beyond that, worship of idols is still not viewed in a positive light by the Torah, anywhere that it's going on in the world, it's not the mission of Am Yisrael to deal with that problem in the way that it is in our own land. In our own land, where we're supposed to be sovereign and be trying to have laws that come from the Judaic system that we get from the Torah, then we're supposed to have concern for that. And it may not be the case that you say, oh yeah, let's let this Canaanite sacrificial cult keep on going right here under our nose and sort of competing and attracting, get the neighbors interested and come over and see if they want to try to participate. Let's have a level playing field of idolatries and other religions and see who picks what. And that's what's fair, right? That's not how we're supposed to operate in Eretz Yisrael. That's the opposite. Within Eretz Yisrael, there are numerous psukim in the Torah that are just saying you tear down their altars and you eliminate the practices that don't conform and comport with the ideology that the Torah is propounding. But in Madagascar, in Brazil, whatever's going on there, it's for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to decide how to deal with that. And it's not your job. I mean, maybe your job to, send out letters, so to speak, like to tell people, you have a different way and be a light to the nations and all of that. But there's a tremendous amount of built-in tolerance from the fact that Am Yisrael are not commanded by Hashem to conquer the world by the sword. And that is not to be taken for granted, because there have been various other kinds of human projects that didn't roll that way, right? And you could say that about conquistadors. You could say that about the Islamic conquests of the known world at the time, when the first caliphates were spreading. You could say that about the Soviet Union. Russia is still the territorially largest country in the world because it is built into the Russian national identity for a long time to feel the need to defend itself against shrinkage by attacking and conquering its neighbors as much as it can. And during the Soviet era, that combined with the universalistic Leninist Marxist religion that it was trying to spread to the world by force and through any means necessary. So, just in the recent era and really, going back further with the spread of Islam and Christianity, you have instances where you have people who are very confident that it's their job, if they can, to conquer the entire world and forcibly convert the entire world to their religion if they can manage it. And their less than fully successful attempts have still managed to rather substantially impact how the map looks, whether we talk about it in religious terms or otherwise. So that is a thing people do and have done going back to, I don't know, the Romans, Alexander the Great, whatever, and further, but it's not something that we're supposed to be doing according to the Torah. And that is a kind of pluralism that the Judaic system should get credit for. But given that, all that being said, that's the case. It's also the case that within this little tiny patch of territory, that is that is Hashem's religious capital on earth, in the view of the Torah. It's a special place with special standards and special rules, and you just have to keep the idolatry out of it, and in a much stricter way than you are required to impose on the entirety of the globe. So that's a first basic point. And I think it has to be acknowledged at this point also, that if we're going back to the Bill of Rights, that this is not as big a difference in some ways as it sounds, in that if you think in terms of what it meant at the time that the US Constitution was framed, to say that there should be no establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion, to imagine that meant, or that really could in any practical or operationalizable way, that it could mean any ideology at all, no matter what it teaches, should be equally protected. That was a contradiction in terms that the US system didn't have to face at the time of its inception. At the time of its inception, virtually everyone was one or another kind of Protestant. If we're talking about people who would become citizens of the fledgling United States. And if there were a few Jews kicking around here and there, then that didn't really pose a practical problem either. There was from the perspective of the powers that were at the time involved, there was enough affection for Jews and ideological commonality with them because of the shared Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, that wasn't much of an issue. But even Roman Catholicism, for a long time after the founding of the United States, was viewed with tremendous suspicion by people, precisely because it was a religion that explicitly identified itself as having some kind of fealty to a foreign power that had wielded political power for centuries in Europe, and had military forces at its back, and obviously kings and queens in addition, that owed allegiance to it at some level. And so once you start mixing politics with what you're calling religion, things do get very complicated indeed. Because what if there's a religion, and I'm not suggesting this is how things played out with Roman Catholicism in America, which turned out not to be something worth being so alarmed about from the standpoint of America's political stability to date. But what if there, you could imagine something you'd call a religion, where part of the teachings of that religion are that you should do everything you can to, in the short term, cooperate with the rules of how the society is run, but in the long term, climb into positions of power and subvert and overthrow the government, and eventually establish a different government that imposes your religion on everyone else. Right? You could imagine that such a religion might exist, and if it did, I think if it became popular enough, that certainly must pose some kind of serious challenge to the First Amendment in a context like the US, because it's one thing to allow freedom of religion when it's just a matter of whether you believe in transubstantiation or consubstantiation, and you're both basically doing, to an unschooled observer, virtually the same thing, but talking in arcane ways about slightly different meanings of some ritual. But it's we're talking about like schisms between different denominations of Christianity. But once you start saying, okay, you could have a religion that is fine with human sacrifice, or a religion that, as we were saying, has an agenda of political revolution. Like take Marxism, for example. Marxism isn't generally in the American system classified as a religion, it clearly, by very obvious metrics, was a religion in the Soviet context, and has outgrowths that maybe you could argue remain a religion or are sort of mutating into new religions these days. You in the American system basically can bar religious indoctrination from public schools, but you can't to the same degree really prevent Marxist indoctrination in public schools, because Marxism isn't identified as a religion because it calls itself, a form of atheism in the way that we were talking about in a previous shiur. Like, it has its gods hidden in the basement to some degree. Although in the Soviet Union, they kept at least one of them in a mausoleum. But the point is that you can have things that at the end of the day function as ideological systems with religious trappings, where you have to make a decision. Is this a protected religion? And if it is a protected religion, are we safe protecting it if it is actually officially and openly at war with our system and wants to overthrow our system? And I mean, the funny thing in the American situation currently is that it can't even ask that question, because Marxism, since it isn't regarded as religion, is in a better situation for spreading itself than other religions, because the other religions aren't allowed in the public sphere as a result of interpretations of there being no establishment of religion, but it can simply become the typical thing that's taught in the public schools, and no one can claim that there's a violation of the Establishment Clause of First Amendment. So it gets actually very complicated as you plot things forward, and the US has had to deal with, and I think in the future as time goes on, will increasingly have to deal with all the contradictions inherent in this question of, well, if we're not going to have an establishment of religion, we can't teach our children things that would be called indoctrination in a creed that somehow would stabilize and support loyalty to the national project that this country is, speaking from the perspective of people in the US. But then if you don't do that, then you can more easily be taken over by other ideologies that are not as eager to play by those same rules. And it's just also the case that the wording and the original design of the amendment, you could argue from perspective of those who drafted it, they were really talking about a subset of religions. And if they had to consider the question of all possible ideologies, they might actually have revealed themselves to be more, let's say, to be less than fully religiously pluralistic, in the way that, from an American perspective, the Torah sounds to be. So I think before we, from an American perspective, look at what the Torah is doing and saying, look, there are certain things you can't allow, I think that actually all systems, including the US Constitution, need a certain amount of that attitude in order to function. And the US will, as time goes on, have to choose between making the decision to say, yeah, there are certain things you just can't allow, or if it refuses to make that decision, then that may spell its end because of its inability to protect itself against certain kinds of ideological infiltration and subversion. And that's a sort of plotting history forward and seeing what happens kind of question. But if we're talking about the Torah itself, there's an easier time dealing with that issue because of its greater strictness on this point. And really, I think, and this is the thing I want to tie it back to in the text, this really comes back to the last shiur where we were talking about free speech, and further underlines that really the degree to which the Torah focuses on the notion of limiting speech, it really is talking about establishment of religion as the main way in which you have to limit speech. And it's precisely because of this idea of violence and political and ideological subversion. Because what was that source again? It was about a mikalel, it was about a blasphemer, but when does the mikalel do his act of blasphemy? And then there's a fight going on between two men, and there's an explicit description of the background of one of the men fighting, where he is the son of an Egyptian and the son of an Egyptian man and of an Israelite woman from the tribe of Dan. There's something a little bit puzzling about why she's from the tribe of Dan, or what would it mean that that would be mentioned. And I think an interesting thing maybe to note there is that Dan is the son born to Bilhah, the handmaiden of Rachel. When Rachel is unable to have children, she says to Yaakov, have children with my maidservant Bilhah, and Dan is born. So what did that make Dan? Dan is like Yishmael a little bit, in the sense that Hagar is the maidservant of Sarah, and then because Sarah can't have children, she asks Hagar and Avram to have a child that will be born for Sarah. And then Yishmael turns out to be this misfit who is a little bit too Mitzri, right? He's a little bit too not from within the family because of where Hagar is from. He's a little bit too foreign, and it turns out that he's kind of headed to become another nation because he can't mesh into the ideological program of this tribe that Avram is creating. And so he gets expelled. So Dan represents at some level the risk that all could have happened again, right? Because Bilhah was not selected by Yaakov to be a wife and to be a mother of his children, but she does end up becoming a mother of his children. And Dan represents the potential for another Yishmael. And of course, it doesn't turn out that way. Dan becomes one of the Shvatim, and there are great heroes of Israel like Shimshon that come from Shevet Dan and Hushim. So this is not to besmirch the reputation of Shevet Dan, but the point is that it's showing that this is someone whose father was Egyptian and whose mother was from Shevet Dan, which represents the possibility of a rupture within the descendants of Yaakov, because of some kind of ideological difference between them, so that they can't be one nation. And it's about violence. It's about the threat that one man poses to another, and that he's attacking the name of Hashem in the midst of his physical attack on another person. And we talked last time about how attacking the name of Hashem can serve the purpose of allowing you actually to wage war against people you want to, because people are made b'tselem Elohim, and you can kill people more easily if you undermine the idea that matters. So I think what this comes back to is that if you look at the US system, there are these obvious carve-outs for shouting fire in a crowded room or inciting violence, that if I stand in a public square and say, I call upon this crowd to go to the house of so-and-so and burn it down and kill the people there or whatever, that's not considered free speech. That's considered the equivalent of murderous violence. But you always have to ask then, where do you draw that line? And the Torah, what it's basically saying is, if you do not draw the line at establishment of religion that is committed to Hashem, then you're setting a clock which may have a much longer time scale in which things happen, where you can be headed to the same kind of problem with speech that is the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded room, right? That if you do not have in your Judaic society the idea that blasphemy is a serious problem, and I'm not talking in practical terms about coming up with some hyper-modern system of punishing blasphemy tomorrow. We're talking about like the same way that Shabbat, Hilul Shabbat, violating Shabbat is a capital crime in the Torah, and it's extremely difficult according to the oral law to actually punish someone for that. But the fact that it's a capital crime shows us its significance and the depth of its importance. That similarly here, the idea of blasphemy is treated the same way, and that we learn to see it as being of significance because of that. Then when we're talking about blasphemy, unless you set up a situation where you protect the name of Hashem and you limit speech in that way, and that really also is the core of your establishment of a religion that is devoted to Hashem as the standard by which everything else that's going on, the altars that you allow or don't allow, etc., are being judged. Unless you do that, then in the short term, if everyone is some version of some kind of Protestant, it seems like, oh yeah, what does it matter? Let's just all sort of each do our own thing, and we'll just come up with even better ideas because there will be a level playing field, and let what is it, 100 schools of thought contend or whatever, which is actually a Maoist formula, I think, but so it wasn't really meant with sincerity, I guess, by the Maoists, but the point is that in principle, it seems like it's a good thing to have a level playing field of even idolatries, and let's say sort of let the best idol win, and then you improve, and maybe that's some kind of mechanism of refining your way to a better commitment to the right kind of religious ideology. But if you don't anchor that and you just say everyone gets the same seat at the table in a way that doesn't distinguish between Bnei Noach who want to serve Hashem but want to do it in this way and are asking what the Torah says about that, and Scientologists or Canaanite idolaters or whatever else, then you're going to end up with a situation where things can go completely off the rails because there's nothing protecting the commitment, the society's commitment to a Kadosh Baruch Hu enough, and there's too much temptation to idolatry that will run in so many different directions in that case. So again, one should remind that in this whole discussion, we're talking about the society that Am Yisrael are expected to build in their own land, and that isn't the same thing as the question of how you solve the problem of idolatry worldwide. But in a sense, it's one kind of an answer to that question, because what it's saying is that the Torah is teaching Am Yisrael and indirectly humanity that you can't wipe out false religion by getting the right idea, gathering a big enough army, and marching through the world trying to get rid of the wrong ideas by force, because the world is too big and people are too flawed and too prone to sliding down slippery slopes into idolatry, even from their own more correct views, as the golden calf reminds us, that even if you are where you are because Hashem got you there, and your explanation of all of that is that you want to serve Hashem, that you can still, with sincerity, make mistakes and end up, one or another sort of idolater. And that's a very complicated discussion indeed, which we could take up another time. But you're not going to bring the whole world to Hashem in the way that the conquistadors tried, or in the way that other, let's say, sort of evangelizing, conquering armies like Alexander or Muhammad or whoever else may have tried. But you can bring the world to Hashem by taking a small patch of the world and being very careful in what you allow to go on there, and having a much higher standard for what's permissible and what isn't, in terms of establishment of religion, in terms of protected speech and not protected speech surrounding the issue of blaspheming the name of Hashem. And if in that one little territory you are more restrictive in that way, then you start to create an example for the world where they can see how it works, and they can start to, consider the arguments that flow from there in this fashion of Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, that the Torah should come from Zion. And this is obviously a very complicated practical discussion that we're talking about. What should we do in Eretz Yisrael tomorrow? And I don't think that this is something that you can treat as a practical issue lightly. And we had another shiur where we talked about how we are in the Torah instructed to drive the Canaanites out of the land me'at me'at, bit by bit. And so this is not necessarily something that has obvious immediate implications or ones that shouldn't be discussed carefully. And yet, I do think it is very important to have the core recognition that if we're talking about a Judaic society, notwithstanding the fact that Jews have greatly enjoyed and been grateful for and been rightly grateful for the safety and welcome shown to them by more religiously pluralistic societies where they have lived in Galut, notwithstanding all of that, a Judaic society is not simply meant to copy that model, because if it does copy that model, it will fail to teach the world what it's supposed to. And there can be something authentically Judaic about being unapologetically insistent about our little patch of land being a place where it's all about Akadosh Baruch Hu, and that can actually be a very expansive and flexible thing in many respects. But at the very least, what it means is that you can't say a law is not Judaic just because it makes it more difficult for someone to engage in certain kinds of idolatry in the land of Israel. And that is a notion that is certainly one we have to insist on in our discussions with the West, because it's a concept that's not really comprehensible in the language of Western level democracy. But if we are confident about the Torah that Hashem has given us, then we'll have great opportunity to teach the world, even maybe some of the limitations and risks associated with their more simple principles and hidden gods.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.